I'm delighted to be here in Madrid and really excited to be speaking to this group. I'm intrigued by the topics you've been hearing over the last few days. They've kept me busy doing interviews and running around the city. I've done 4 other lectures here in Madrid, which is why I have not been here, but I'm looking forward to seeing some of the videos of the other talks, and I was delighted to catch the tail end of that one. So in convergence culture, well, let me say a little bit. I'm going to talk off in a sort of formal way, but I'm going to break periodically for questions because I want to make sure we have chances to interact and I can address the questions that come up as we talk. In convergence culture, I sort of make a kind of underlying argument that the moment I was writing in the early 2000s, we were learning through play skills we would later apply to more serious matters. And I hinted at the ways we might take what we were doing as fans, as consumers of popular culture, and apply it to politics, to religion, to education. I spent the second half of the last decade really trying to do that, working with education, working with political groups. Right now, I'm part of a MacArthur Foundation network of researchers that is looking at youth and participatory politics. And I have a team at MIT, USC, called the Civic Past Group, headed by Sangeeta Shrestova, who's my research director, and involves about 12 graduate students and 2 postdocs that are starting to look at new forms of activism that have emerged at the present moment. So I'm going to draw on their research. I'm going to draw on some ideas from my book, Spreadable Media, which I wrote with Sam Ford and Joshua Green, and that's coming out next January in English, and we hope soon in Spanish, to talk about transmedia in relation to politics, and sort of use them both to inform each other. Draw on political uses of popular culture to think about transmedia, to draw on theories of transmedia to talk about political change. So behind us here is a photograph one of my grad students took at the Occupy Los Angeles camp. And the sign says, "Hilarious pop culture reference makes ultimate message more palatable." And that's the sort of sign there. So it's a kind of empty sign for a process that they're suggesting happened again and again in the Occupy process, that people were using imagery from popular culture to connect their ideas to a variety of publics. And that's part of what I want to describe there and talk about how that relates to transmedia. So we can begin our story with Alan Moore and David Lloyd's V for Vendetta, a comic book that clearly was informed by the political history of Great Britain, that uses Guy Fawkes' mask as an emblem of resistance, that imagines a future society that looks an awful lot like Thatcher's England, as Alan Moore imagined it, and creates a very compelling narrative. The Wachowski brothers then adopt that narrative into a feature film, right, and build on it. His version, Alan Moore's version, was about Thatcher. The new version is largely about the Bush administration and the war on terror, and that's sort of the way it's read in the United States as this film comes out. Now, there's already debate in transmedia theory about are adaptations transmedia or not, and my position is always that if they're redundant with the original, then it's not actually yet transmedia. But Christy Dina has made the point that almost all adaptations add things, change things, their interpretations of it. They are minimally moved from one medium to the other. You can tell the story differently in comics than in films. So in some ways, V for Vendetta as a movie could be seen already as a transmedia extension. The movie comes out, and if you looked on YouTube, any number of people appropriated imagery from V for Vendetta to create new YouTube videos, often connecting the image, the soundtrack to the film, and particularly the speech of the rebel against the government in the film, to images of Bush, Blair, Cheney, the other leaders of the war on terror, right? That becomes a kind of common form of political activism. Then there's a picture, 4chan. And 4chan is an online community in the United States that was partially informed by similar practices in Japan, similar practices that started around anime and manga fandom, in a culture rich in a tradition of media mix. It's a space where all kinds of discussions take place, all kinds of images get manipulated. Whitney Phelps, who's a grad student at the University of Oregon, talks about the process of 4chan as a digestive process. In other words, they suck up and devour everything in the culture and they shit it out the other end. You know, the sort of 4chan prouds itself on a kind of excrement on the culture, a troll-like response to the culture around them, in which, you know, you're trying to provoke people, agitate people in order to provoke a response. But in that environment, they borrow lots from popular culture and repurpose it. And one of the things that comes out of the 4chan movement has been the Joker Obama images that circulated through the United States. So Obama, read through the lens of Heath Ledger's version of the Joker, becomes a political icon that starts out just as a joke on 4chan, got appropriated by the Tea Party, and these images, the word "why so socialist" gets added by the Tea Party, and so that becomes a kind of icon of the right in the United States. 4chan, on the other hand, starts to get angry at the Church of Scientology and begins the anonymous movement where the Guy Fawkes mask is used to mask their identity as they direct their protest against the Church of Scientology. And it's kind of an interesting moment, since Church of Scientology was started by a science fiction writer. So we have fans turned activists protesting a fandom turned into a religion. And it's kind of weird paradox where popular culture's role in this plays itself out. So as Anonymous gains momentum, then the mask that Anonymous uses then gets appropriated by Occupy Wall Street and gets used in part of the protest all over the country. So we're suddenly seeing protesters wearing Guy Fawkes masks. And finally, within Occupy, there is a division about the Guy Fawkes mask, because while Guy Fawkes mask in England is a sign of political resistance, it's trademarked in the United States. So the Warner Brothers owns all the franchise for the Guy Fawkes mask in the U.S., so any protester buying a Guy Fawkes mask to wear in an Occupy protest is actually feeding money into a major media conglomerate. And so there's an education campaign over who owns, whether that's a good idea or not, whether that's we should abandon that because it's putting money into the 1%. So the question is, and to what degree do this use of the Guy Fawkes mask represent a transmedia extension, right? To some degree, it's not authorized, it's not top-down, it's not controlled, but they have added layers of meaning and layers of media production to the story of V for Vendetta. The V for Vendetta is extended into new spaces and to new meanings, to new audiences through these activities of these various protest groups. So if we go to my classic definition of transmedia, we define transmedia storytelling as a process where integral elements of a fiction gets dispersed systematically across multiple delivery channels for the purpose of creating a unified and coordinated entertainment experience. Ideally, each medium makes its own unique contribution to the unfolding of the story. So most of what that definition here would hold for the Occupy's use of the V for Vendetta mask, right? It's dispersed systematically across multiple media channels, both physical performance at the Occupy site, the YouTube videos created of those performances, the Flickr photographs created around them, the blogs and social media discussion around it, all moves pieces of that story across media systems. The question is whether it's unified and coordinated is the central question you were discussing at the end there. And Lena was telling us the problem with Occupy is it never actually cohered into a single message or a single story. It was very, very effective at creating what I would call multiplicity. And one of the debates I've been challenging in terms of thinking about transmedia is we usually gravitate toward the notion of continuity, that is a unified story, the continuous story, all the pieces add up to one coherent world. But as we begin to open it up to grassroots participation, as we see everyday people taking the story and building on it, then we have to open eyes a world of multiplicity, that is multiple versions of the story that are told in different ways for different purposes. So Occupy may represent the extreme case of transmedia activism, where there are in fact many stories and many images, and I'll show this as we go forward this some more. Each of those stories, though, makes a unique contribution to the unfolding of the story. So the story of V for Vendetta goes from a critique of Thatcher's England to a critique of the War of Terror, to the critique of the Church of Scientology, to the critique of Wall Street and the banks, and the economic system in the United States. That each of those pieces of media adds layers to the potential significance of the story that Alan Moore originally told. And in the process, Alan Moore has lost control over his own narrative in a way that transmedia may create a great deal of anxiety for transmedia producers. One of the things I always want to stress when we talk about transmedia is that it's not radically new. It doesn't depend on the existence of digital media, that we can go back in time and talk about, for example, L. Frank Baum, the author of The Wizard of Oz, in the early 20th century, was a transmedia producer by the definition I just provided. The Wizard of Oz is experienced by most of this room as a simple story, the story of the MGM Judy Garland musical, probably. In fact, there were 20 novels Baum wrote, which take the world of Oz and expand it out in all kinds of directions. At one moment in time, there were two totally different comic strip series, one by Baum, one by his illustrator, both telling the story of Scarecrow and Cowardly Lion and Ozma and so forth in new ways. He owned a production company that made films, so he made films. He produced Broadway shows, that all of which added new elements into the world of The Wizard of Oz. And L. Frank Baum called himself the royal geographer of Oz, which is to say that he understood himself as a world builder who created a rich environment out of which lots of stories, lots of characters, lots of things could go on, and he saw himself as touring a fictional world. We could take this one more generation back, right? So if we think about ourselves as a peasant in the Middle Ages, if you're a priest, the story of the Bible is a text, right? A single self-contained narrative. If you're a peasant who can't read, the stories of the Bible come at you from every available media channel, from paintings on the roof, to songs from the choir, to court dramas, to nativity sets, to rituals of various sorts. You're bringing together all of the available media of that time to construct an understanding of the most important message of the time, the spiritual message of the church. So again, what's new is not the existence of transmedia platforms to tell stories from, or the construction of stories and mythologies that can be told across media channels. What's new is a particular conception of the audience as networked that I think has changed the dynamic of transmedia. So this, for example, is a organizational chart for the Zion Resistance Army in the Matrix movies, right? Not just in the Matrix movies, the Matrix franchise, because the pieces of information on this chart don't exist in any single text. Some of them are in the movies, some of them are in the anime, some of them are in the comics, some of them are in the games, some of them are in fiction that circulates around it, but the community collectively pulled those pieces together and constructed a vision of how this works. And they use that tool to make sense of the complex and dispersed text that the Matrix represents. So I first started noticing something really interesting 20 years ago when I was watching Twin Peaks and I was participating in my first online fan community. And what I saw was the newspaper critics were saying Twin Peaks had become so complex that no one understood it. And the fans online were saying Twin Peaks had become so simple it was no longer interesting. Now the gap was between an individual critic trying to watch TV on their own and a community of people, thousands of people, putting their information together, comparing notes, critiquing each episode day by day on the week between when they aired, and there wasn't enough to feed them. They were hungry for more information. They wanted things to do. They wanted meaning to create. And so the desire for complexity pushed television toward more seriality, more ensemble cast. And when that doesn't satisfy us, then we've started moving more pieces of information into comics, into games, into the web. We want a story bigger than any given medium is willing to tell us. And that's the impulse on the audience side that leads to transmedia. Now, in convergence culture, I talk about this in terms of cultural attractors, that is what draws us to a text, and cultural activators, what gives us something to do. So here's an example from Lost. This is a very complex picture. It flashed for split seconds a few times in the middle of a first season opener of season 2 of Lost. You couldn't read it. It just... And so people began to use their digital tools to freeze frame the image, to take blurry photographs, put them on the web. Different people captured different details. They began to create composite maps. They began to identify what the text said. Then they have to figure out what the text means. They have to understand what these locations are. They had to spot the locations as the show introduces those locations into the story. So this one strobe-like effect created opportunities for the audience to put lots of pieces together over an extended period of time. It gave Lost fans something to do. Now, if you don't give them something to do, or you come too late to give them something to do, they do it on their own. So this is an image from Pottermore, J.K. Rowling's project, to extend Harry Potter and to serve, she would say, serve the fans. I would say regulate or control the fans, because part of what she tried to do was take a fan culture that had 10 years of history and put it back in a box. What Pottermore sort of says, we're going to sort you into a house, you know, and Harry Potter fans had long been interested in the four houses, Ravenclaw, Gryffindor, Slytherin, and Hufflepuff. Those are the ways they formed identity in the world of Harry Potter. And they had created a range of different mechanisms to sort themselves into houses, and the social structure of fandom had organized around those houses, and every Harry Potter fan knows what house they belong to. So I'm a Ravenclaw, if anyone's interested. Right? I'm a member of the House of Ravenclaw. So then, suddenly, J.K. Rowling says, join Pottermore. We have this mechanism that will sort you into house, and then will give you extra information depending on which house you belong to. And that sounds great, except she's randomly sorting people into houses that they don't belong to, right? They have a strong sense of identification in their house. Suddenly she's created a controlled mechanism that gives them information based on what she thinks they should get, not based on their own sense in a grassroots community. And so the Harry Potter fans turn on Pottermore, right? Because Pottermore is too late in the game, too controlling of the audience behavior, doesn't acknowledge the existing activities and grassroots connections people have formed to the property. Glee is an interesting case in all of this. Glee has been probably the most successful transmedia franchise in the United States in the last 2 or 3 years at least. And it's successful because not of storytelling across media, but performance across media. So at this point, in 2 years' time, the Glee cast have more #1 pop hits in the United States than either the Beatles or Elvis. They've broken both the Beatles and Elvis's record because the songs go from the episodes directly into iTunes. People download them, they listen to them. Well, what we see here is not iTunes, but this is YouTube. And what's going on YouTube is fans are taking those songs, performing them. They're lip syncing them, they're karaokeing them, they're creating music videos to them. And that's further creative people taking content, quote, illegally, pirating content, we could call it. Let's call it unauthorized use of content. That is nevertheless not piracy, and it hasn't damaged the brand. It's increased the value of the brand. And that's the sort of paradox that we're looking at as we think about popular culture at the present time, is more and more unauthorized use are enhancing the value and meaning of that content in the culture. And I think that's where we have to flip the discussion. Now, I would describe Glee as transmedia performance, but not transmedia storytelling. As I said, we could have told the story of the high school and the students and the teachers. We don't do that over the web. There's not webisodes for Glee and so forth to any great degree. It's about moving the performance across the web. And that reminds us the word transmedia by itself simply means across media. So transmedia storytelling is one kind of logic about how content moves across media. Transmedia performance is a different one. The two could overlap. We could imagine the two being combined, but it's useful to pull out these different logics so transmedia storytelling isn't stretched beyond recognition to refer to all kinds of transmedia activity that are not ultimately about storytelling. So we could think about transmedia branding as another example of a transmedia logic, which has often overlapped with transmedia stories. A lot of transmedia stories are funded as from promotional budgets. But Coke does transmedia, has always done transmedia, going back to the Santa Claus images it created in the early 1920s, where American Santa Claus is Coke branded, right? That red suit was the Coke red colors because Coke created our image of Santa Claus. And every time we see Santa Claus in American culture, we're seeing something Coke created, right? So that's amazing transmedia narrative that Coke created again in the early 20th century. Or we could talk about transmedia play or transmedia sport. And games are not stories necessarily. There's been a huge debate about games and stories. They sometimes can tell stories or contribute to stories or contribute to story worlds, but they also can do something quite different. And games represent transmedia play. Politicians are involved in transmedia campaigning, right? And Obama, Obi-Wan Kenobi is a transmedia character, but so is Barack Obama, right? Obama exists in both top-down, campaign-controlled content and in bottom-up content, where his fans appropriated and remixed him. But Obama lives through every media platform. And so to understand contemporary politics, we need to understand Obama and his, use of social media as a kind of transmedia logic, which could or may not involve storytelling, or may not involve branding, or may not involve play. Those things can mix in a variety of ways, but they are all logics or ways of understanding how we structure content and relationships across media channels. So let me pause for a minute and see if we've got some questions so far on what I've been saying. Does this make some sense to people? Is there anything I can clarify or address at this point in the talk? Let me put my headphone on in case there's anyone. Yes, there's someone back there. Someone's coming to the mic now.
Hi. Speaking here from the point of view of the content creators and producers, since you never know if a product you're going to make is actually going to explode or not, I see it's pretty feasible that the creator doesn't create in time, as you were mentioning, enough pieces to complement the story. If it really takes off and the audience wants to put in their own bits and pieces. So do you have any suggestion at this stage of the conversation in terms of maybe the author, the original creators said, well, we have this idea, but we haven't mapped it out completely, and then they're successful and it takes off, and then just to avoid what Pottermore, the Pottermore case you were talking about.
Well, I think I would start with the idea of not controlling the conversation, but monitoring the conversation. So one of the things that people talk about brand communities is if brands created communities, and brands don't create communities, they court communities. There are ongoing conversations out there that brands insert themselves into, or media franchises insert themselves into as resources for those communities to have the conversations they want to have. Eric von Hippel, the MIT Sloan School professor who talks about manufacturing, talks about lead users. And he says more and more manufacturers are throwing prototypes out into the world, not quite completed, then allowing particular user bases to build on those prototypes. Early adapters, also early adopters, they take what's out there and they retrofit it or hack it together to serve a different purpose that maybe the manufacturer never anticipated. And what Eric von Hippel advocates is that manufacturers like Lego, that's his classic example, monitor the behavior of those early adopters, watch how they modify the product, and then take insights from that to build the next generation of products. Well, what if we thought of that in terms of entertainment content? What if we thought of our fans as the lead users of an entertainment franchise? That they proposed possibilities, that we can see which characters click, we can see which aspects of the world they want to explore, we can see which themes emerge to those fandoms. If we monitor them and engage with them, then the next phase of the construction is responsive to that. Now, fans always talk about fanon versus canon, right? That they certainly have things they'd like to see, but they understand that their produced stories are not official stories. They're unofficial stories. And a lot of the pleasure is, in fact, seeing stories that could never be officially produced. So what you're describing is understanding your fan base well enough through tools like netography to go in, understand, monitor its discussions, and then come back and modify the story to make official those elements that are consistent with the creator's vision of the narrative and build a stronger relationship with the audience as you go. The problem is our ideologies about creativity, in the Western world at least, are about individual invention and don't acknowledge even the collaborative part of building a broadcast franchise, let alone the collaboration that any traditional storyteller had with their community. And I think that's what's got to change. We've got to question our notion of creativity to embrace a stronger dialogue with the audience at every step in the process. So right now, I think the model is the audience takes your intellectual property against your will and it depreciates it. That is, it devalues it. What we want to turn it around and say the audience taking your content against your will appreciates it. In two, at least in the English language, two senses of the word. Appreciate, it means to like something. I appreciate you. It also means to increase the value of something. Appreciation, as in an investment, appreciates. Fans are doing both. They like it and they appreciate the value of it through their creative grassroots activities. But where you try to rein them in and regulate them too late, you become the bad guy in the story rather than the facilitator of the story, and that's what happened to J.K. Rowling, I think, with Pottermore. Any other questions? Should I go on? Okay, I will go on. So let's then go back to Occupy for a minute and talk about then what Occupy is doing in the process of transmedia that I'm describing here. And in doing this section of the talk, I'm drawing heavily on the work of one of my colleagues at USC, Alison Trope, and one of my graduate students, Lana Schwartz, who took lots of pictures and gathered lots of pictures to help us think about the visual iconography of Occupy. And what was striking is how often brand images and franchise-based images fit into the communication system that Occupy is involved with. And we sort of see here a use of the brand. Bank of America's brand is being used as part of the political message-building activity. Now, I stumbled into this when I went to New York and visited the site of Occupy Wall Street. And as I arrived in New York, as I arrived at the site, a whole busload of zombies unloaded. Right? And these were people who had been at the local horror convention in New York and decided they wanted to join the protest. So there was a busload of people in zombie costumes who came out to the protest and were carrying signs and staggering around, talking to people and so forth. Turns out the zombie was one of the many, many images that the Occupy movement used to process or signify their opposition to the unequal distribution of wealth and opportunity in the United States. And the zombie, among many other things, stood in for corporations that should have been dead and were kept alive artificially from by the blood of the 99%, i.e. by government subsidies. So on one hand, the zombies were a political metaphor. On the other hand, for a lot of the people there, they were a reference to a transmedia franchise. The Walking Dead was probably the most persistent and central narrative about zombies in American culture at the time the Occupy movement is going on. So they were harnessing the myth-making capacity of Hollywood and The Walking Dead to create a metaphor that could then be photographed and videotaped and travel through YouTube and Flickr and social network sites and become part of a larger system of communication. That Occupy becomes a kind of provocation for conversation, for discussion, to change the way we talk, the language we use to think about the political process. So here we see some more examples from Lana and Alison's photographs. The American flag dominated by corporate logos. Or we see the man from the Monopoly box being carted off to jail. Right? Again, very recognizable images of popular culture that are being used politically in this way. We see Smithers from The Simpsons, or Burns from Simpsons saying, "I am the 1%, Smithers release the hounds." There's a whole Occupy Sesame Street movement. 99% of the world's cookies are consumed by 1% of the monsters. Batman gets used in a variety of ways. Here, Batman says, "Raise my taxes." Right? So he's in favor of fairer taxation. Whereas here, Batman says, "Instead of paying taxes to support a corrupt system, I put my money where it does the most good, a utility belt full of sharp pieces of metal that I throw at the mentally ill." I'm the 1%. Bruce Wayne, also known as Batman. Right? So the story of Batman gets used to construct a series of myths around Occupy that then can travel across the culture. And there are two signs side by side, one about Star Wars, the other about Captain America. And so what we're seeing is almost everyone at the Occupy site is in one way or another connecting with narratives. So the day I was there were people dressed like characters from Game of Thrones, talking about the Lannister 1% and warning that the winter is coming. And those became protest signs as well that connected the protest to a variety of popular media franchises, which ensured that it got dispersed around a variety of different spaces. Now, it's not a coherent set of stories, right? And that goes back to Lena's critique, and I think she was right about it, that in the end, this multiplication means it travels everywhere through all kinds of communities. It changes the discursive context in the United States, but it doesn't contribute in an active way to material changes in either policy or politics yet, right? No one's been able to act on the Occupy message. And it does boil down to a struggle over who occupies space. Some of this was more effective in Wisconsin, where the same sort of tactics first emerged. I think, on my consciousness at least, we were seeing, because the governor of Wisconsin, who was taking aim at public unions, was known as Walker, there were Imperial Skywalker signs everywhere in the streets of Madison. Walker Texas Ranger signs. And my colleague Jonathan Gray talks about this as kind of building solidarity, a kind of American style of carnival, which allowed people to come together and enjoy a more festive relationship to politics, but also a language that was less off-putting, a sense it wasn't policy wonk language, it was now language we have in our everyday life, that we connect with these images in a certain way, that in a world where remix is part of how we play, turning politics into a mode of remix allowed more people to feel a connection emotionally and to be able to participate in the political process. And it also was a language that could be understood across groups, because popular culture is the shared culture of America at the current moment. But the lack of coherence is interesting to look at alongside this image, right? This is an image of a very well-established media franchise, media empire in the United States. Walt Disney took stories from across European folktale traditions and commodified them into mass media characters that lived in films, television shows, comic books, children's books, stuffed toys, and most importantly for him, his amusement park. And part of what he did was create a kind of incoherent world that nevertheless was branded by Disney, has an overarching logic that when we see these characters together, we don't have a shock of intertextual vertigo, right? We don't look at these and say, my God, what are the three little pigs doing next to the seven dwarfs? That's not something that ever crosses our mind anymore, because those relationships of multiple vehicles through which Disney promotes its ideology is well established, and there's a certain coherence that gets achieved over time, that we know what a Disney movie's about, we know what it feels like, we know the emotional qualities of Disney movies, we know who they're addressed to. So multiplicity doesn't necessarily result in total fragmentation or incapacity. It's how do we build connections across the various stories that are being extended on a grassroots level in this new kind of transmedia storytelling activism. Now, the costume play, or cosplay as it would be called, that's part of Occupy, is part of a larger media system, right? And a lot of people sort of saw problem in the United States was partially the mainstream media took forever to start covering Occupy. European media covered Occupy better overall than the American media did. And so people started saying the media is not covering what's happening. Thousands of people are gathering and they're getting no media coverage. And so people began using citizen media tools to circulate those messages, and used every platform available in the digital age to get the message out. So the logic of the politics became transmedia logic, transmedia activism, because you're saying, I don't have access to broadcast capacity. I'm going to use every tool available to send this message out to as many different communities as I can. So we might use, this is a map someone did, a Google Maps, to demonstrate how many protests there were, just to quantify the protest and how widespread they were across the country at the peak of the Occupy movement. Here are tools where people exchanged posters and pamphlets that could be easily printed off the internet and photocopied or distributed in some way. This is maybe the most spectacular example of what Occupy did in this regard. This is the pepper spray cop, right? The pepper spray cop was a campus policeman at the University of California, Davis campus. A group of protesters is sitting peacefully on the lawn. He wants to disperse them. He walks casually by and pepper sprays them in the face. Now, you can imagine this is a story that would have gotten almost no play in American mainstream media. Maybe the student newspaper would report it. If they were lucky, some Southern California local paper might report it. But the event takes place on Saturday. By Monday, hundreds of these mashups of pepper spray cop juxtaposed with famous paintings, with scenes from movies, people peacefully gathering, of famous protest scenes. All of those are the pepper spray cops inserted into hundreds of these. And the news story that got the attention in the United States about pepper spray cop was the sheer proliferation of these remixes. New York Times read the story about the pepper spray cop because of the remixes. And no one saw all of those remixes, but there was a sense of just grassroots production of these remixes that started to spread through the web that called out attention to this incident, and it succeeded in making the pepper spray cop one of the icons of the Occupy movement. So it's a politics based on circulation, a politics based on spreading content actively, consciously, using strategies derived from fan culture and derived from transmedia storytelling, right? That the logics are ones that these protest groups are adopting those logics to create new kinds of political tactics. This is a global phenomenon. This group of protesters are Palestinians who march through the occupied territory. Every weekend they march through the occupied territory protesting Israeli status on their land, or what they saw as their land. They walked through the occupied territory, they recorded their protest, and about 100 people saw it, right? This particular weekend, they painted themselves blue, like the Na'vi in Avatar, and they marched through the occupied territory chanting, "Sky people, you can't take our land." And they recorded the Israeli army tear gassing a bunch of Na'vi who are riding on the ground choking on the tear gas, and it's captured on video. It goes out on YouTube. There are multiple versions of it. Some of them remix footage from the film with the protest footage. And these videos travel and get millions of views all over the world. And the images are printed in newspapers around the world. So they created this moment of massive visibility because they attached themselves to the images from popular culture. Because Avatar was everywhere. Everyone knew how to read Avatar. The protest movement attached itself to Avatar. So we can read this in two ways. We can say this is entertainment values intruding into news and politics, a trivialization of the political process. Or we can say this is protest hijacking mass media and using its resources to get visibility for its message. And I'm inclined to go with the second in terms of what happened here. What's interesting is that behind this particular group of protesters have a very media-rich, text-rich site with lots of information. So most of us who saw this picture probably didn't get beyond the picture, but the picture itself embodied something of the conflict. But if you follow the picture back, as you can do easily in a network culture, there was a lot more data-rich information there. There was what Jason Mattel would call drillability. You could drill down, get more information, get more context, and understand the issue in a deeper way. So most people didn't go there, but a higher percentage of people went there than would have gone there with the old traditional messages. And the result was that it had some educational function for people who might never have paid attention to the issue of the occupied territory in any other way. So it's a kind of tactic that worked in increasing visibility. Now, this is the stuff at the heart of our book on spreadability. So this is what the Spreadable Media book that I wrote. You see Joshua Green on top, Sam Ford next to him. It's a product. It started as a white paper that my team of researchers at MIT created, and particularly Chao-Cheng Li and Anna Dam worked together with me to develop this white paper. And then we built it out to a book. And around that book will float about 40 essays by industry people and academics discussing the ideas in the book. Those will start rolling out digitally and for free starting in November. And by January, there will be lots of discussion of spreadability when the book comes out. So we built a discussion around the book even before the book's coming out, and we're applying our own ideas about spreadability to the book. So what is the book about? It's about what we call circulation versus distribution. So if we think about distribution is the logics by which media industries have long worked. And mass media, conglomerated media, have been very effective at controlling the distribution of its content. Simple example, The Avengers opens in Europe a week before it opens in the United States. right? So that's a plan. For whatever reason, the studio decided we want Europe to be talking about the Avengers and giving good buzz for the Avengers, and then Americans get to see it. And Americans are sitting in the United States squirming, waiting to see it. It hits the theaters and massive, box office. That's a decision of distribution. Circulation is a more hybrid system. It's still shaped by commercial decisions, but increasingly circulation is shaped by decisions made by everyday people who are inserting greater control over the process of cultural sharing, right? That they're choosing media, they're passing media along to each other. They're doing so through unauthorized circulation. Now, I use the word unauthorized circulation to avoid the word piracy, because the word piracy carries such moral baggage that it doesn't allow us to really think about how value is created or meaning is created in this new system. So this book is about circulation. Near the end of the book, we quote the science fiction writer and blogger Cory Doctorow, who says that what's wrong with current intellectual property regimes is they're written by mammals. Now, what he means by that is that mammals reproduce only a few times in the course of their lifetime, and they always know where their children are. So you don't mess with my kid. I'm going to protect my kid. I'm going to watch where my kid goes. I'm trained. And if we think of our creative acts as our brain children, then the tight control over intellectual property is a logical extension of the way we treat our children. But he says in the digital age, we have to move to think of our intellectual property more like a dandelion. The dandelion produces lots of seeds, and the wind takes those seeds and they blow them everywhere. And some of those seeds land someplace and they're fertile and they grow, and other places they land on the sidewalk or they get swept away and nothing happens. But enough things grow that I don't think any of us think of the dandelion as an endangered species, right? The end times, the cockroach and the dandelion will still be there. Will be long dead, but they'll still be there because they have the most effective system of distributing their seeds everywhere. So what Doctorow was arguing is that artists and creators and activists and educators need to think of their content in terms of ways to ensure that it circulates, that it spreads across the culture, that it travels in effective ways. And so you design the content so that it connects to particular communities, becomes resources of those communities, and they pass that content along to the next person. Now, what I'm describing is not viral media. Viral media is, I think, a metaphor that I find less and less satisfying to explain what these phenomena are. Right? Viral media is based on a metaphor of infection. Metaphor that implies a human host, it catches a disease, carries it back, and infects their friends and family. If you caught the flu, and then your wife caught the flu, and your kids caught the flu, you know what a virus is all about. Right? Here's Neil Stephenson, the science fiction writer in Snow Crash, who wrote one of the first vivid descriptions of the theory of viral media. He says, we're all susceptible to the pull of viral ideas, like mass hysteria, or a tune that gets in your head that you keep on humming all day until you spread it to someone else. Jokes, urban legends, crackpot religions, Marxism, that's his politics, I'm not commenting. No matter how smart we get, there's always this deep irrational part that makes us potential host for self-replicating information. So look at all the language there. We're susceptible to it. It's mass hysteria. It gets stuck in our heads. It's irrational. We're host. It's self-replicating. All of those are languages of passivity. All of those are things that happen to us that we don't control. So if I'm a mass media producer, yeah, I want to hold on to a viral media theory because it says I'm still the one who designs the virus that infects the population. It allows you to feel like you're in control when in fact you're not. And one of two things happens. You either have experts who tell you, I can help you make your content go viral, give me lots of money. Or you have this kind of passivity and say, I don't know what really happened, it just went viral. Right? But either way, viral seems to explain everything when in fact it explains nothing. Right? Because it doesn't go to the social choices people are making about passing along media. It doesn't really explain why out of the thousands of pieces of media that come through my inbox every day, I choose 3 or 4 of them to pass them along to specific people with specific messages involved through specific networks technology, right? I'm making a series of micro decisions of which content to pass along. And those decisions have to be understood through social mechanisms, through cultural mechanisms, not through purely passive decision making. The original use of viral was Hotmail. And Hotmail was a case where if I signed up for a Hotmail account and I sent an email to someone, I couldn't help the fact that there's a Hotmail ad at the bottom, and lots of people signed up for Hotmail because I sent them a Hotmail email. That's viral, right? I'm passive, I can't control it. When Farmville announces to all of my friends that I just bought a cow, how embarrassing, that message is one that I often don't control. And so that may be a viral message. Everything else we're calling spreadable, right? And we've heard every joke possible about spreadable, right? Spreadable is compared to jam, to peanut butter, to pate, to cheese. Choose your cultural reference, right? The idea, though, is that activity of spreading something on bread is a human activity that shows agency. It's also intended to contrast with the notion of stickiness, right, which has been a central vocabulary of the digital age. But stickiness is about a roach motel, right? You have this thing, you draw people's eyeballs in there, you hold them there as long as they can't break free, and you win if you hold their attention longest. But stickiness was about a logic of locking down content and locking down consumers. The new era of social media is a logic of circulation. The more places your content travels, the more people engage with your content, the more people pass your content along, the more valuable that content becomes. And so the slogan for the book is, if it doesn't spread, it's dead. If it's locked down, you're out of the conversation. If it spreads, it becomes part of you in fact succeed. And for some groups, like activist groups who have no money to buy broadcast time, the ability to spread content through a variety of social networks enhances their communicative power to no end. That's where power in activism lies right now, is being able to take small investments or allow your supporters to create their own media, put it in circulation. Some of it spreads, some of it doesn't. But as it circulates, it gains new eyeballs, more people become attentive to it, and it becomes part of the story of your movement in one way or another. So let me again pause and see what questions people have, and then I'll go with the final part of the talk. So has anyone got a question? Do you want to follow up now? I surely said something controversial in all of that. Okay, we will continue then. Okay, so part of what I want to suggest then is if we don't see this as passive, can we understand, as we think about social movements and political movements, as part of a spreadable media ecology, can we understand some of the properties that those movements need to have in order to increase circulation? And I saw recently this blog post by Jason Mogus about invisible children in CUNY 2012, which is maybe the most spectacular example of circulation by a political group I've seen in a long, long time. But talking to the folks at headquarters in San Diego, Invisible Children said that they expected this 30-minute documentary about human rights violation in Uganda to reach about 500,000 people by the end of May. In fact, it reached 77 million viewers in 4 days' time. That's astonishing, right? Without being broadcast, it reached more people than watched the highest rated show on American television, which would have been seen by about 40 million people that week, or the number of people who went to the highest grossing film in the box office that week, which was Hunger Games, that got 15 to 17 million viewers that week, depending on how you count. So you could add those two things together and still not get the number of eyeballs that saw CUNY 2012 as Invisible Children circulated. Now, we can critique the politics of it, we can critique the method of it. There's a lot to critique about CUNY 2012. But what we want to know is it may represent a new model of how politics by circulation operates at the current day. And we should be studying what worked and what didn't. Why the organization imploded, why it couldn't stand the stress of reaching that many people that quickly, why it wasn't ready for it, why it didn't have drillability, so it couldn't why it didn't train its supporters to be able to rebut critiques of the organization and construct counter arguments. Lots to critique about what Invisible Children did, but we can't critique the success of getting that video out. So Jason Mogus says those organizations that are successful at building network social movements, first, they specialize in doing one or two things incredibly well, and typically not policy work, typically not passing laws, but typically building mobilization and awareness is the central goal of those organizations. For them to work, they need to partner effectively with other kinds of organizations that are more effective at making things happen on the ground. Second, Mogus tells us, everyone in the organization, or at least a critical mass, is aligned around the main goal or campaign, and everyone knows how to use the web to grow their movement. There's some consensus narrative that's driving the movement, and CUNY 2012 was very, very effective at reducing it to a simple narrative that had strong emotional power that everyone who saw it wanted to pass it along. And then it got critiqued for being too simple, for being not fully contextualized. It didn't have drillability, but the simple narrative was one that had a strong emotional hook that people passed along. Communications is a core capacity. It's not seen as not seen as not the real work, and doesn't have to fight for resources. So one of the critiques of Invisible Children is they spent far more of their money on building communication capacity than doing things in the ground in Africa. And that makes sense if you're looking at it as a traditional NGO or charity organization. But they saw themselves as an organization that recruited and trained activists and prepared the next generation for civic participation. And so they saw the social media as a core capacity that they were using in order to build an effective organization. So people power lies at the core of their theory of change. It's not an add-on, it's why they exist. And again, if you go to CUNY 2012, it begins with a celebration of the power of people in an age of social media, and it ends with a request to pass this content along. That the message is framed in terms of that people power. There are actions and support programs for less engaged people, clicking, sending, medium engaged people, often real-world events, turn up at a rally, and super engaged people help us lead and campaign. And indeed, if you look at the organization of Invisible Children, which my team's been monitoring for 3 years, they have all three levels. They've had 8 years of videos in circulation. They've had many public rallies and events, and they have an organization that trains roadies and youth to participate and to go out and organize screenings in their community and spread their message. So there are multiple ways of being engaged for that organization. And finally, they're close to their supporters, asking what they want, constantly testing their ideas from them, and sometimes even following their leads. And I would say this is where Invisible Children failed organizationally, was they put too much control over the activities in the group and a small number of people. So that when Jason Russell had his nervous breakdown, they had to scramble to get the next generation of leadership ready to take ownership of the campaign. And that meant that the grassroots on-the-ground stuff was not fully achieved because they were scrambling to respond to all of the questions, debates, and didn't have time. The people who would have been organizing the stuff on the ground were stepping up and becoming spokesmen. And so there was a kind of demolition that took place as this thing started to spread that I think tells us how centralized their message was and how problematic that was going to be in the long term, because Jason Russell was so identified with the message that when he was damaged, his credibility, then the message was damaged, and the organization was damaged by that process. Now, a more interesting and effective organization, I think, has been the Harry Potter Alliance. What a very interesting group. They have about 100,000 young people in 62 chapters, mostly in North America, who are involved in human rights activism in the name of Harry Potter. All right, so you get to that and it seems like a punchline. But in fact, if you think about the generation that grew up reading Harry Potter books, who grew up learning to write by writing Harry Potter fan fiction, now they're moving into becoming activists in part by using language and metaphors from Harry Potter in order to engage in the political process. Andrew Slack, who's the trained community organizer who started the Harry Potter Alliance, says, Harry Potter is the story of a time of great evil and turmoil. The government is covering it up. The concentrated media is refusing to tell the citizens the truth. The schools have become progressively more repressive and silencing students' freedom of voice and protest activity. And Harry organizes an underground protest movement, Dumbledore's Army, and goes out and changes the world. And so Andrew Slack turns to young people and says, what would you like to change about our world? And how do we change it together? And it becomes an open-ended network structure to identify issues and tactics that they begin to mobilize. And its core strength is to mobilize circulations, mobilize publicity, to connect things. Now, this is not culture jamming, right? These are ad-busting images of the 80s, 90s. We talked about culture jamming. That was shutting down the communication system, right? Jamming the channels. This is what he calls cultural acupuncture. What his theory of change is, you attach yourself to those central pressure points, the central cultural discussions of your society, and your circulation gets carried in the wake of the larger conversations. So what Andrew Slack discovered was that every time a Harry Potter book came out, every time a Harry Potter movie opened, the news media went berserk for a month or two and had to cover one story after another about Harry Potter, and there was only so much they could write. So if founding an organization that talked about Darfur or gay marriage or whatnot and called itself the Harry Potter Alliance, the news media sooner or later covered the story, and he started getting more and more visibility and publicity for his group off the fact that the news media was hungry for Harry Potter content. So he mobilizes Harry Potter as a set of metaphors and becomes part, I would argue, a grassroots part of the Harry Potter franchise in order to get his message out. So, for example, he partners with labor unions that are organizing at Walmarts in the United States and creates a video called Harry Potter and the Prisoners of Voldemort. He works with Free Press, Robert McChesney's organization that's opposed to media concentration, the media reform movement, and talks about bolder media. And again, organizes and creates awareness among Harry Potter fans about concentration of media and how that blocks the flow of messages. He does it largely by tapping into the infrastructure that fans had created. So the Harry Potter fans have been along for 10 years or so, as I said. They built a lot of grassroots practices and communication channels. Rather than shutting them down, as Rowling tried to do, what he's done is courted them and embraced them and uses them as a vehicle through which the message can flow. So they're podcasts that were created by Harry Potter fans. So he goes on the podcast and talks about politics. There are wizard rock bands that use MP3 files to spread music that the grassroots community has created. So he has rockathons and brings those wizard rock people together and creates albums where the wizard rock performers talk to the fan base about the messages, and they write songs about his messages. They're bloggers who are really central to the community. So he goes out and solicits those bloggers to become part of his movement. And I mentioned before the houses. What he does around gay marriage is in California and Maine, where there were state referendums around gay marriage, he has a house competition. So Gryffindor and Ravenclaw are competing to see which one can bring the most voters to the polls and get them to vote. So he uses the structure of fandom in a way that's organic to fandom, that feels right to fans, to empower them to participate. Now, what our research tells us about young people is that young people's political identities and activities get shaped very early in life. By the time they're 16, 17, it's pretty clear which kids are going to be political and which ones are not. And the political kids had political parents. They had teachers in social science who got them interested in current events. They were participants in after-school activities. They did volunteer work in their community. Those things determine your political identity and the degree to which you're an activist or not. What's interesting is Harry Potter Alliance is recruiting kids who are culturally active, they're fans, they're fan creators, and turns them into people who are politically active. So it's not the usual suspects who just simply go from one activism to another. He's expanded the base of activists by recruiting young people who are fans and giving them a way to take their language as fans and shape it into the political process. Now, on the one hand, he's embraced by J.K. Rowling. This is not oppositional creativity. This is something Rowling likes. Rowling was part of Amnesty International before she retired from there and became a writer. The politics of this group around human rights is courted to be exactly the same politics as J.K. Rowling. Warner Brothers has a more problematic relationship here. Warner Brothers has sort of embraced them sometimes, but the most recent campaign they've launched is called Not in Harry's Name, and it's about fair trade chocolate. Right, that Warner Brothers chocolate contracts go to countries that employ child labor and don't have regulations of child labor. And so they're trying to push the chocolate contracts to companies and countries that actually have fair labor practices. And Warner's has so far resisted this. So we now have a case where Harry Potter fans are organizing against Warner Brothers and challenging the way Warner Brothers is running the Harry Potter franchise. And that's become a central campaign. The other problem that Andrew Slack and the Harry Potter Alliance is facing is the Harry Potter phenomenon may be dying down. So their response was, why don't we reach out to all kinds of other fans? Because fandom is bigger. Most fans don't just like Harry Potter. They also like Hunger Game or Twilight or Glee or all of these other franchises. And so he's created a group called Imagine Better. It's a network of other fans that reach out and brings people together around fan campaigns. So when the Hunger Games opened in the United States, he had attached a campaign to raise money and awareness for Oxfam, to Hunger Games. It was called Hunger is Not a Game. This got such visibility, it was reported in a big story in the New York Times. The story comes out, Lionsgate Studios outraged by their appropriating their intellectual property. Lionsgate sends out a cease and desist letter. Rather than backing down, they've turned to high-placed bloggers who publicized the cease and desist letter. And they turned to change.org and they set up some petitions, and people began rallying around the petitions protesting Lionsgate trying to shut down a campaign to raise money to deal with world hunger. By the midday on Friday, the day the movie opens, Lionsgate calls Andrew Slack and says, how do we help your campaign? In less than 24 hours, they moved from cease and desist to seeking to participate because they felt the muscle that the fan activists had been able to demonstrate in getting awareness and visibility out through acts of a politics of circulation. Now, one of the ways they did it is they partnered with another group called the Nerd Fighters. And the Nerd Fighters was organized by a young adult writer, John Green, who's done a number of young adult novels, but he wanted to create an online community that grew much bigger than that, and its politics is very simple. It is decrease world suck. That's the platform. Decrease world suck, make the world a better place. But that platform pulled together kids who were interested in social change, and that platform then allowed them to attach a variety of messages to it. And this, in turn, is communicated through a range of different media imagery, right? So these are Nerd Fighter shirts. I think you can probably recognize which franchise each of them were drawn from. So they're using those pop culture images to then align themselves with a variety of fan communities. And so this network has now become very, very effective in bringing about change. One last example, or two last examples quickly, of this example of this style of new politics of circulation. Last summer, Superman in a alternate universe storyline in the DC Comics denounced his American citizenship, saying he was no longer fighting for truth, justice, and the American way. He was fighting for global justice. The American right wing went berserk. Now, people who've never read a Superman comic book were weighing in about how outrageous it was that this great American icon was being turned to European socialism, right? And that was sort of the dominant response of the right wing. But we were studying the Dream Activists, which are a group of undocumented immigrant youth in the United States who are fighting for the passage of the Dream Act, and the Dream Act would bring about more citizen rights and more education rights, particularly for young people born in the United States whose parents were illegal. And they're in a really odd bind because they're not American citizens and they have no other country they have citizenship with, and they're fighting for their rights. And they looked at the story and said, when did Superman ever become an American citizen? Right? If ever there was an illegal alien, it's Kal-El of Krypton. Right? This guy slipped across the border illegally, right? You know, he had no green card. He doesn't have a visa. He arrived from the skies. He's adopted by an Anglo family who mask his identity, and he goes out in the world and he works, and even works as a journalist, God forbid. Right? And no one notices because he's not wearing his glasses. Right? So this is how you pass as an illegal alien. So they started a whole set of campaigns that centered around the idea that Superman is an illegal alien, and using that story to sort of get people to think about the politics of immigration in the United States in a different way. Now, other people took these images, and there was a series of photographs, very striking photographs, that showed superheroes doing the work that's often done by illegal immigrants in the United States. And this is an example of what my USC, now MIT colleague, Sasha Costanza-Schock, talks about as transmedia mobilization. That is, they're using these transmedia images in ways that create a multiplicity of messages. That what's striking about the Dream Activists is they're decentralized in every sense of the word. These are activists who, in America, immigration politics typically organized by nationality or ethnicity. This is a coalition of young people across all ethnicities who are affected by immigration policies. It's decentered in the sense that it's geographically dispersed. And that became very important when the debate moved from the national level to the state level. People could quickly mobilize, compare notes, organize together. These are people who don't own their own computers, yet have become incredibly effective at using social media and YouTube, particularly as a platform to get their message out. So they're pointing the camera at themselves and saying, I'm Jose and I'm undocumented, and telling their story and putting it up on YouTube at enormous personal risk, right? Some of these kids are being deported because of things they put on YouTube. But they're not going silently into the night. They're using Twitter to continue to talk about their deportation while it's taking place. And increased awareness of the number of deportations, the fact that Obama has deported more immigrants than Bush did. And that's put enormous pressure on the Obama administration to change its immigration policy. So this was an incredibly effective strategy through which social media plays a key role, and superhero comics just became one central icon. This is just another example of their use of superhero images for recruitment. Now, does this have anything to do with transmedia franchises as we've been traditionally understanding them? It's transmedia activism, it's transmedia storytelling in a certain way, but how does it connect to commercial broadcasters? And the classic example so far has been the Colbert Show and the Jon Stewart Show, the kind of news comedy that's very strong in the United States right now. And Colbert, as a performer, early on embraced these grassroots participations and did a variety of things to get people involved. So one of the things he did is he made havoc with Wikipedia. He asked the fans who watched his show to go on Wikipedia and change information about elephants. It was totally trivial, sort of troll-like behavior, change the material about elephants. I talked to Jimmy Wales, one of the founders of Wikipedia, and he said yes, and we had to organize the Wikipedians to be ready. Every time someone from the Colbert Nation changed the entry about elephants, our guys changed it back. And it led to this massive edit war. Well, that's play, right? That's a recreational, somewhat antisocial use of social media. But then later, Stewart and Colbert organized a march on Washington, got people mobilized politically, and encouraged them to participate in the political debates around the last election, right? So they moved from training people how to use social media and remix culture for fun into using it for political means. And that's, I think, been a core transition. So this is a case where their brand could embrace the political changes they represented, and they could travel with it, and they became politics became part of their franchise. Or J.K. Rowling's politics was capacious enough, connected enough to the message of Harry Potter Alliance that she's aligned herself with it. Whereas Lionsgate's had to struggle with what happens when these activist groups attach themselves to a transmedia franchise and add new layers to it, new meanings to it, extend it in ways they hadn't anticipated. And the Occupy people are struggling with, if we borrow the V from Vendetta mask, are we supporting the mass media companies that created the franchise to begin with? So this is the kind of tangle we're in right now. It's a complex set of negotiations, but it is very much part of what politics and communications and storytelling looks like in the age of spreadable media. So I'll now open it up for some final questions. Sure.
Bueno, tenemos tiempo para unas cuantas preguntas. Yo creo que ha sido una magnífica clase. Vamos, yo todavía tengo la cabeza llena, excepto saber que tengo que ser menos mamífero y más planta, lo cual me es fácil porque tengo alergia, estoy involucrado en la vida amorosa de las plantas, o sea que, bueno, pues podemos empezar si tenéis preguntas y aquí.
Hi, Henry. Thank you for a wonderful talk. I would like to put a question that we were discussing in the last talk, and it's about Coney and about prolonged engagement. It seems that, almost every day or every week a new attractor, cultural attractor seems to come around, and then people kind of forget the last one. So my question is, do you have any insights how to prolong this engagement? You talk about fan communities as maybe being more kind of prolonged and extended, and for example, Jane McTonigal talks about gamification and how games kind of could get this kind of extended engagement going. So maybe insights on that.
All right, well, let's start with the lessons from CUNY 2012 and what we know about it. So this is an organization that had an 8 or 9 year history focused on a single issue that had produced 50 or 60 videos already and thrown them into distribution, that had built 100,000 plus organization of grassroots community organizers. They saw CUNY 2012 as just one more piece of an ongoing communication effort. They were not prepared for the fact that that video got picked up and spread as fast as it did. And in fact, they were redesigning their website. In a lot of ways, they didn't have the infrastructure in place yet for the campaign because they expected it to move gradually. And for whatever reason, this time, it spread at a really dramatic rate. and they crashed and burned, right? Now, what's interesting is they didn't totally crash and burn. So the second Cooney 2012 video they produced moved from 77 million viewers to 2 million viewers. Now, does that look like a defeat? Well, if your expectation is 77 million people would continue to watch the second video, yes, that's a total cut down. If your expectation was 500,000 viewers, 2 million viewers is an extraordinary success. The same thing happened with the grassroots campaign. They got more people than they initially anticipated, but fewer people than the inflated numbers would suggest. So what we're seeing is that lots of people passed the video along, created engagement, awareness around it, but most of them were not deeply committed to the cause or deeply committed to the organization. But in the process, they increased the number of people who were. There was clearly more people connected to it now than were before, even despite all of the enormous critiques and pushbacks and legitimate criticism that their efforts received. There's nevertheless gained ground on that. And so the question, are they sustainable or not, I think we have to see what happens next. But to say that they were not sustainable when they have an 8-year history is probably not right. That they've been in there fighting this, they haven't succeeded. And again, that might be a measure of success, that they haven't changed, Cooney's not in jail, they haven't changed American policy, Obama hasn't gone to war. Those things may not have been a realistic set of expectations, but they may have helped build a generation of activists who pay more attention to Africa than most American kids have done before. And again, maybe the wrong message, but they built a group. So I would say you could learn a lot from looking at Invisible Children. The big thing we saw, two big things we saw when we looked at Invisible Children, again and beyond the paternalism and colonialism and all of the ideological stuff, was number one, they didn't have drillability at that moment. They had a simple message that spread fast, but there was no way you could follow that message back and drill down. What they did, and should have been their goal all along, was to open up a conversation. Right? Lots of people wrote editorials, lots of people wrote blog posts, there was lots of attention paid to the issue. Lots of smarter people than the Invisible Children weighed in on this issue and had a platform to talk about this issue with some visibility because Cooney 2012 was circulating as it did. So drillability was created, but not by the organization. And so the organization lost control of its message and was unable to shape what happened next. The second is their followers had been trained to deliver a message, but not to defend the message. So some of the dominant critiques of Cooney 2012, there were arguments for. There were debatable propositions, but they weren't responding, and their grassroots community was paralyzed because the top-down leader wasn't prepared to give them the message quickly enough because he was in the hospital, and the organization was grappling with that personal tragedy. And so lots of people were left unarmed, dealing with the critique during that period of time. So there, you have the opposite problem that Lena was identifying with Occupy, right? Occupy had they had dispersed leadership, no centralized message, not a coherent narrative it's telling. Here we had too tight a narrative, too tight a leadership, and when it was unable, that leadership collapsed, there was no one to step up. Whereas I would say the Harry Potter Alliance has a balance between some clear leadership and spokespeople who help define the terms and help shape the organization, but then a dispersed network of organizations, any one of which can take action, any one of which could move in response and can propose themes the unit or as a whole can deal with, or in the grassroots level can deal with. And the Harry Potter Alliance is no longer tied to a specific issue. It's mobilized around a range of issues its members wanted to act on. It supported them in a variety of ways, and it's now trying to unmoor itself from a single text, but apply this logic of cultural acupuncture to the full range of fandoms and cult media texts that are out there. And so I would say if I'm making a bet about which of those organizations sustains itself and has the greatest impact long term, I'm going to make it based on the Harry Potter Alliance. Yes, someone over there.
Allí.
La haría en inglés, pero me voy a enrollar un poco, así que lo hago en español.
Okay.
Espera, que prefiero que me vea.
Okay, there we are. Sorry.
¿Better?
Yes, much better.
Usted ha dicho, hablando de los derechos de autor, usted ha mencionado, ha hecho una relación con el hecho de ser mamíferos y de conocer nuestras crías, o sea, de cuidar a las crías, de estar cerca de ellas. Entonces, ¿dónde dejamos el cambio que se produce entre la Edad Media y la modernidad donde con Descartes, con el pienso, luego existo, con la invención de la imprenta, en realidad los derechos de autor surgen con la aparición de la imprenta, con Descartes, con el pienso, luego existo, entonces, y con la modernidad. O sea, la separación entre sujeto y objeto. Entonces puedes poseer el objeto. Eso me lleva a plantearle otra pregunta. Yo no sé, tal vez el concepto de fan a mí me parece un poco peligroso. Porque es un sujeto y objeto, en cierta medida integrados, donde el sujeto, el fan, es objeto, con lo cual es comercializable. No sé qué le parecería, está en el mercado, no sé qué le parecería la opción que David Cronenberg propone en Existence, que en vez de fans, seamos gamers. Como Allegra Geller dice, I don't wanna fans, are you friendly? Are you friendly? Play with me. I don't wanna fans, I wanna gamers.
Okay.
Well, I don't know what you think about it.
Okay.
Thanks.
Well, first of all, I think the first comment's valid, but I think you're reading Cory Doctorow's comments about mammals and dandelions a little too literally. I think he's being playful, creating some metaphors to talk about different copyright regimes, but I don't think he's making a causal claim, really, ultimately about, copyright being intrinsic to humans, because he wants to change the way we think about copyright, and therefore, if it was basic to humans, it couldn't change. I think Doctorow would say we're at a moment, or what I would say is that right now we're at a moment where the moral economy that shaped old copyright regimes is breaking down and the new system hasn't emerged. So the term moral economy comes from social historian E.P. Thompson, who talked about, again, early modern Europe, the very period you're talking about. And what Thompson said was that as capitalism emerged from feudalism, there was an enormous amount of unrest, a lot of peasant uprisings, a lot of things, because we'd broken down the sort of moral understanding, the social understanding people knew how to operate with. Before there's trade, he says, we have to trust each other, and that trust is based on social understandings. And he says, as that disruption takes place, then various groups make bids for what the new system should look like. They bid for legitimacy. They propose different solutions. So we can see our present moment as one where copyright holders and the Pirates Party, say, are making competing bids for what the new system should look like. One is saying sharing is caring. The other is saying you wouldn't steal a pocketbook. Why would you steal a movie? Right? And those stealing versus sharing are two very different languages to discuss the system. And the problem is we have yet to resolve a system that both producers and consumers think is fair around copyright in the digital age. For that to happen, I think governments and companies have to actually be prepared to talk to consumers. If this system is imposed from above, then consumers are not going to consent to the system as it emerges. What gives me some hope is we're seeing copyright activism around the world start to get traction. More and more of the public who are aware of issues of copyright are mobilizing around it, as happened in my country around SOPA a little while ago. And that's bringing about change. Now, your second question, for me, a fan is not simply a consumer or simply a market. Fans have a history of, from the very beginning, from the middle of the 19th century, using media effectively to communicate their own ideas. So for me, the fan is a gamer of the cultural system. The fan is a poacher or appropriator who takes the stories and builds on them and uses them as resources. Both the fan and the gamer, though, are also caught within a system. The gamer can reprogram, the hacker can break out of the system. The gamer plays an interactive environment designed for them. And the fan works with a story that they partially buy into. So it's not about absolutes, either inside or outside. It's about negotiation with a complex situation where we are collaborators with the political and culture. And collaborators I'm using intentionally in the way you might use it in Europe in very political loaded terms. That is, someone who works within a system that they may see as partially corrupt, tries to pursue either their own interest or a social interest as best they can, sometimes is co-opted by that system, sometimes makes a positive difference. And that would be the way, say, a character on Battlestar Galactica who's a collaborator might have thought of that participation in that movement, or Rick in Casablanca might think of himself as a collaborator. Those choices, are ones that are difficult because it's not a black and white anymore. We are connected to the culture.
Perfect, thanks.
Sure. No.
Muchas gracias. Quería preguntarle al profesor Jenkins por ya que hoy estamos relacionando transmedia con acción social, quería preguntarle por el anonimato o por la ilusión del anonimato. Tradicionalmente, la participación en un movimiento de acción social ha estado siempre amparada, en unos casos, por protagonismo de los participantes, en cuyo caso les importaba poco que estuvieran identificados por el sistema, contra el que en principio pues querían ir de alguna forma, y había otros muchos potenciales participantes que no entraban a formar parte de ese movimiento precisamente por el peligro a ser identificados por el sistema, con lo que eso conlleva quiere decir en cuanto a potenciales efectos contrarios a la persona, por parte precisamente del sistema. Muchos expertos opinan que uno de los grandes éxitos del sistema en cuanto a la llegada de Internet y de todo lo que conlleva Internet ha sido precisamente hacernos creer a todos que en Internet somos más anónimos que en el terreno de lo real, por así decirlo. Quería preguntarle su opinión sobre si precisamente los activistas sociales transmedia en estos medios, con estos recursos, son conscientes de esa falta de anonimato y precisamente en el ámbito de la cultura de Internet eso es un incentivo más para participar en esta acción social, o si, por el contrario, el anonimato es algo que se cree que se tiene, pero no está tanto ahí. ¿Cuál es el papel del anonimato? Muchas gracias.
Again, a very complicated question. I would say in the early 1990s, New Yorker told us on the internet, no one knows you're a dog. In 2012, everyone knows what dog food we eat. That's been a shift, right? Data surveillance is very much real and very much part and embedded in most of the social network technologies, and we ignore it at our own risk, right? We are not anonymous to at least the corporations and the data collectors and the data sellers, and we have to educate ourselves about how that data surveillance takes place. Now, the interesting thing is there's a lot of activism by fans and consumers against Facebook and the other social media sites around these issues. We're not ignorant, we're not passive. We've used these tools to organize and challenge those companies. But also, as someone like Trevor Schultz would say, once we're bought into Facebook, our content is locked down, our social relationships are embedded there, and there are enormous social costs to move to another platform, which means we become a captive audience of Facebook in that society. So that's one dimension of this discussion, right? And it is, in fact, we should not feel secure in our being anonymous. But there's also been a politics of masks that runs throughout human history. So we could talk about the Guy Fawkes mask that I began with, or we could talk about the blue face paint that the Palestinians used to become the Navi, right? And they're both part of a political language that has a long history. So in early modern Europe, protesters painted themselves as Moors or Amazons to hide their identities and to be able to involve themselves in street action. In my country, the founding fathers painted themselves red and dumped tea in the Boston Harbor, right? That those were languages of wearing masks through which protests could take place. So if we say we have absolute anonymous qualities in the modern world, that would be wrong. If we say we can mask our identity some of the ways, and masking our identity empowers us to act collectively rather than individually, then that's a long history pre-digital that continues into the kinds of protest groups that we're describing today. So to some degree, that image of masks runs through my talk and does represent a kind of politics of the anonymous.
Bueno, casi no queda tiempo. No sé si hubiera una última pregunta, bien, si no, pero corta. Vale. Aquí.
I'll make it a short answer, which will do better.
Solamente quería hacer mención a un videojuego que, bueno, que está bien que se mencione porque hace mucho tiempo que se lanzó y es un videojuego que promueve eso, el cambio social, que es sobre el docugame que se sacó sobre Escape from Boomera, que era el juego modificado del Half-Life, el motor de Half-Life se modificó para mostrar la situación tan penosa que vivían los inmigrantes que llegaban a Australia y hacerte vivir que estabas dentro de un campo de concentración donde estaban ahí por tiempo indefinido, y eso fue la conjunción de investigadores, periodistas, desarrolladores de videojuegos que hizo que ese problema tuviera visibilidad y al final se solucionase. Y me parece muy interesante como algo que se hizo en el año 2003 o 2004, no recuerdo bien. Nada, solamente era mencionarlo y decir que eso, que también a través de un videojuego pues se puede crear esa mentalidad de jugador sin muchos problemas.
Yeah, there's a strong tradition now of activist use of video games, whether it's protest marches inside World of Warcraft. There was a protest march in a Chinese game that involved as many as 1 million players protesting in a game who had the mask of anonymousness in the game, or relative anonymous in the game, who wouldn't have gone in front of tanks in Tiananmen Square, but did march and protest inside a game space. We've seen games get adapted and reprogrammed, modded in a variety of ways. There's a great game some years ago called Lost Disneys, which was about corporate concentration, which is a first-person shooter where you battle your way up Main Street in Disneyland and do battle with the Gestapo who work for fascist Walt Disney. And a very political game that nevertheless got people playing it who thought about and got them to think about things in a new way. The same but there's nothing guaranteeing that that's going to be progressive, right? So there are racist games. The Ku Klux Klan has produced games in the United States that appropriate mass media and turn it toward alternative political views as well. So I'm not celebrating this as always leading to progressive politics. I'm saying that our politics, of whether right or left, will in the current time be shaped by these acts of appropriation and remixing. And they will become part of the futures of transmedia storytelling.
Bueno, pues llegamos al final de estos 3 días. Yo creo que es muy interesante. Quisiera dar las gracias especialmente al profesor Jenkins. Yo creo que todos recordaremos que hemos asistido a esta sesión. Ha sido una sesión extraordinaria por su parte. Agradecer a todos ustedes por haber venido, a todos los ponentes y especialmente pues a Fernando Carrión y al equipo de Fundación Telefónica que ha trabajado muchos meses para hacer esto posible y espero que podamos repetirlo en años siguientes. Entonces, un aplauso para todos nosotros.